If silver breaks a certain level, margin calls cascade, losses explode, and the fear is not just financial, it's reputational. Because once the public realizes a market was being restrained, you don't just get price movement, you get questions, you get investigations, you get people demanding physical, and that's when the paper game gets dangerous. So what would a system do? It would try to delay. It would try to absorb. It would try to contain the breakout long enough to reposition. And yes, sometimes that means leaning on the biggest balance sheets in the room to do what smaller players can't. Now let's talk about the critical mineral angle again, because this is the part that really changes the tone. Critical mineral status isn't just a label, it's a permission slip, it's the justification for policy action. It's the kind of designation that can be used later to restrict exports, direct supply chains, prioritize domestic buyers, subsidize production, and quietly influence market structure. And if silver is being pulled into that world, then the old assumptions about price discovery start to fall apart. Because if the metal is essential to defense systems, power grids, advanced electronics, and high-end technology, then it stops being just another trade. It becomes something governments want secured, and when governments want something secured, market price becomes a suggestion. Now I want you to picture what happens if the public fully internalizes that silver is critical. If regular people believe the metal is strategic, they start to hold it differently. They stop selling dips. They buy and lock it away. They treat it like insurance. And the tighter the physical market becomes, the more unstable the paper market becomes. Because paper assumes that physical supply will appear when needed, but what if it doesn't? That's where backwardation enters the conversation. Backwardation is a fancy word for a simple message. People want the metal now more than they want the promise later. In normal conditions, futures prices tend to be higher than spot because storage costs money, insurance costs money, and time has value. That's normal. Backwardation flips that. It says urgency. It says stress. It says trust is thinning out. And if you combine backwardation with rising lease rates, meaning it becomes expensive to borrow metal, you're seeing the system's pressure points. Because lease rates don't spike for entertainment. They spike when metal is scarce, when borrowing is urgent, or when the lenders smell risk and demand a premium. Now here's the part that matters for retention. Because this is where most people stop thinking like analysts and start thinking like spectators. If you see repeated sharp sell-offs right as silver approaches a cost of borrowing metal jump, what does that suggest? It suggests someone is trying to push price down while scrambling to secure metal, and that's the nightmare scenario for a short heavy structure. The need to suppress price while the physical supply tightens. Now let me ask you another question, and I want a real answer in the comments. If silver is truly strategic, do you think governments would ever admit there's a supply problem? Or would they manage it quietly until it becomes impossible to hide? Because the answer to that question determines how you should interpret everything you see from mainstream coverage. Speaking of mainstream coverage, watch what they do when silver starts moving. They don't explain the plumbing, they don't talk about deliveries, they don't talk about lease rates, they don't talk about the distinction between paper exposure and physical tightness. Instead, they do one of two things. They either ignore it until they can't, or they flood the zone with narratives designed to make you feel stupid for paying attention. That's how these cycles always work. And if you've lived through enough market events, you've seen it. The story always arrives late after positioning is done. Now there's a big reason this script you're hearing right now matters. Not because it predicts an exact date, but because it identifies a pattern, and patterns are what keep you from getting blindsided. Because if the system is being forced to choose between allowing price discovery and protecting stability, it will choose stability until the cost becomes unbearable. And that cost is rising, not just because of investment demand, but because of industrial demand that doesn't care about chart patterns. Industrial demand doesn't stop because an RSI indicator says overbought. Defense demand doesn't pause because someone on TV says silver is a bubble. Manufacturing pipelines require metal, period. And if that metal isn't available, someone has to pay up or someone has to go without. Now let's talk about the part of the story that people find disturbing, historical admissions. There have been cases where regulators and insiders acknowledge that concentrated positions and management happened. Sometimes it's framed as market stability. Sometimes it's framed as liquidity. Sometimes it's framed as just how the system works. But the point isn't the specific names. The point is the precedent. If precedent exists that authorities can nudge institutions into taking positions for stability, then the idea of an emergency pressure event is not science fiction. It's consistent with the logic of crisis management. Now, do I want you to panic? No, I want you to pay attention, because panic makes you impulsive. And impulsive people become exit liquidity. What I want you to do is understand the structure so you don't get manipulated by headlines. Now, quick but important, if you've had any success in your life, business, investing, career, anything, I want you to share a short version of it in the comments. Seriously, because when people see real success stories from regular viewers, morale changes, and people stop feeling like they're alone in this. And by the way, creative quick plug right here. If you want silver-related success stories specifically, there's a link in the description to another channel where people share how they've built wealth, what worked, and what failed. Subscribe to it too and binge a few stories, because real examples beat motivational quotes every time. Alright, back to the core of the script. Let's say silver keeps pushing upward, and the market keeps reacting with these sudden dumps. At some point, the dumps stop working. Why? Because physical demand absorbs them. And if the East industrial hubs, refining hubs, demand centers keeps vacuuming up metal whenever price dips, then the West is left with more paper and less physical, and paper is only credible when it's convertible. That's the quiet truth nobody wants to say out loud. Now here's where the cliffhanger gets real. If a major bank was pressured into holding a short position as part of a stability strategy, that bank becomes a pressure valve. It becomes a temporary shield. But shields crack. And when a shield cracks in a market like silver, you don't get a gentle move, you get a jump, you get a gap, you get a repricing that doesn't ask permission. Exactly what happened is this. Behind closed doors, a quiet emergency message went out that effectively boxed one giant bank into taking the other side of silver, right as silver pushed toward that psychological breaking point near triple digits. And if that sounds insane, good, because the more you zoom out, the more it looks like silver isn't being treated like a normal commodity anymore. It's being treated like a strategic resource that someone somewhere cannot afford to let run free. Now before we go any further, because I'm about to connect dots most people refuse to connect, help me out with something real quick. I am running a campaign to eliminate copycat channels that recycle the same stories and slap new thumbnails on them. If you genuinely get value from this kind of breakdown, hit subscribe and comment, Ogjonag, so I know you're actually with me. It takes 2 seconds and it matters more than you think. And one more thing, if you want daily updates, extra posts, and my personal analysis that I do not put on YouTube, I created a WhatsApp channel for that. It includes instant updates, voice notes, and premium posts that never make it here. The link is in the description. Join it now so you're not always a day late. Alright, here's why this emergency order story is not just another conspiracy clip, and why it lines up with multiple events that have been stacking up like dominoes. Because first, silver got reclassified as a critical mineral in a way that immediately changes the conversation. When governments start using phrases like critical and strategic, they're not talking about jewelry demand or coin collectors. They're talking about supply security. They're talking about defense. They're talking about national leverage. And when a metal gets moved into that category, the rules quietly change. Not on your screen, not in your brokerage app, in the backrooms, in procurement, in export controls, in refineries. In who gets priority access when the physical market tightens. So the question isn't, is silver going up? The question is, who is desperate enough to keep silver from repricing in public? Because a true repricing doesn't just move a chart, it exposes positions, breaks narratives, and forces accountability. Now let's talk about the global squeeze that most people don't want to look at. Because it's happening in slow motion, and it doesn't have a single dramatic headline. Yet, you've got multiple power blocks moving in the same direction. Protect domestic supply, limit what leaves the country, and secure refining capacity. That's not normal market behavior. That is what nations do when they think the next phase of conflict is economic and the supplies they need are going to get harder to source. And then you've got this other layer, deliveries. Because in paper markets, people rarely demand delivery. The whole game is designed so they don't. Most participants roll contracts, cash settle, or just trade the paper price. But when you start seeing repeated waves of delivery interest, especially outside of major delivery months, it's like smoke pouring out from behind the wall. It's the market whispering, I don't want the promise, I want the metal. And when that starts showing up in numbers that feel abnormal, that is the kind of thing that can trigger emergency thinking in places that usually do end panic in public. Now, I want to slow down and be very clear here. I'm not asking you to blindly believe anything. I'm not asking you to trust rumors. What I'm asking you to do is watch the behavior, because markets lie with words all day. They confess with behavior. Here's the behavior we're seeing. 1. Silver is being treated like a strategic resource, not a commodity. 2. Physical demand keeps draining available supply whenever price dips. 3. The paper market keeps showing signs of stress whenever silver approaches a major psychological level. And 4. The entire system has a history of managing metals when the price threatens to send the wrong message. Now, let me ask you a question that I want you to answer in the comments because this matters. Do you believe silver trades like a free market? Or does it trade like a controlled market that occasionally loses control? Put free or controlled in the comments and tell me why. Because once you answer that honestly, everything else starts making more sense. Now let's talk about something that almost nobody talks about in a way that's easy to grasp: concentrated shorts. In a normal market, you might see producers hedge, funds speculate, and banks facilitate. But what people have pointed out for years is that silver isn't just shorted. It's often shorted in a concentrated way, where a small number of large institutions carry an outsized chunk of the burden. And when only a few players are holding the weight, you have to ask the most important question. Why would anyone volunteer to be the designated villain in a tiny market with explosive upside risk? That's not a rhetorical question. If you told a rational trader, hey, there's a commodity with relatively small above-ground tradable supply, huge industrial demand, and a global audience watching it, want to hold a massive short position, a rational person would say, no, thank you, I like living. So if that short position exists and persists, the motive matters. The common story people tell is, it's just hedging. But hedging doesn't require extreme concentration. Hedging doesn't require repeated episodes of suspicious selling into thin liquidity. Hedging doesn't require fines and admissions of manipulation in the past. So what's left? One possible explanation is that silver's price has consequences beyond the metal itself. That it's tied to signals governments and central institutions don't want flashing across the world, because gold is a monetary alarm bell, and silver is a monetary bell plus an industrial bottleneck. That combination is dangerous to a system that survives on confidence, and I know some people hate hearing that, but ask yourself, when confidence cracks, what happens to paper promises? Now let's bring it back to the claim at the center of this video, an emergency order that pushed a major bank into shorting silver. Here's how that idea fits the reality without requiring you to believe every dramatic detail. Imagine a scenario where an institution is overexposed. Maybe not just one institution, maybe the system is exposed.